This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. As usual, please rate and review the podcast on podchaser.com or the Apple Podcast Store, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Well, we've got some exciting news. After talking about this for probably the whole 2 years that we've been a podcast, we're finally going to light up a private Facebook group called Deconversion Anonymous. Arlene from episode 71 has graciously volunteered to help to be the community builder and help people along and administer the group. We are hoping to build a supportive community for a safe place to land for people who are in the middle of or just after or long after deconstruction and deconversion. I'm hoping that it does not become a place where we just take pot shots at Christianity. That's just too easy. We want to leave space for people to vent, but primarily we're trying to answer the question, what next? Now that we've gone through deconversion, how can we become fuller human beings? How can we support one another as human beings? So we are hoping to build a community of graceful human beings. If that sounds interesting to you, please request access at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. One other exciting thing about participation from the community is Logan Thomas, who goes by Beyond Belief, has reworked the digital art for the podcast. So within the next week, possibly even as you're listening to this, depending on when you listen to it, but definitely by next week's podcast, we are going to have new artwork for the podcast. So don't be surprised if it looks a little bit different. I do want to thank the person who did the original artwork. That person wanted to remain anonymous, so I'm supporting that. But I'm incredibly grateful for them, and I thank them. And I thank Logan for all of this new work, and hopefully you love it. Join the Facebook group and you can talk about it. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. On to today's show. My guest today is Ginna. Ginna is an incredibly intelligent software developer. She has an incredibly articulate way of reducing the absurdities of her experience with Christianity to one sentence. I'm going to quote her a bunch in the final thoughts section, but I think you'll pick them up as you hear her story. There is a small content warning here. Ginna is incredibly honest and open, and she talks about her bouts of depression. That includes some suicidal ideation. So if that is at all concerning for you, please put this one away and come back to us next week. Ginna absolutely lives up to the honesty contest and has a really powerful story to tell. So here is Ginna to tell her story. Ginna, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I actually don't know a lot about you. You have reached out to me to tell your story. Thank you for responding to my desperate request for people to come on and share their stories. So let's jump right in and hear about what was your religious tradition growing up?
Yeah, great question. So I grew up originally in a super charismatic type of non-denominational church.
Okay.
And then in high school ended up, I'll kind of give you a summary because I feel like I ran the gamut. Well, in elementary school, I went to a Southern Baptist elementary school. Then in high school, ended up in a Presbyterian Church in America, PCA, super Calvinist type of situation.
Wow. Okay.
And then in college, I went to a Lutheran college. So I feel like I've kind of done a little bit of everything.
I think you got the religious bingo or Christian bingo there. Yes.
For sure.
Were any of those transitions more or less difficult?
Well, I loved the growing up in the charismatic church. That was so much fun. My household was very kind of, I would say, emotionally reserved. And then we would go to church and it would be so great that I could just like clap and dance around as a little kid. And like, it was just like 100 people in the church. So everyone was always like loving on me and like wanting to dance with me and stuff. So that was actually, I think, a really great emotional outlet, especially for someone growing up in like a household where things are like pretty quiet and stilted.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that I got to grow up in that, even though, I mean, as we'll get to, there's a lot of things about growing up in a Christian household that I would not choose for myself.
There's definitely a rest of the story. So yeah.
There's the rest of the story.
Yes.
It's over. We can go home.
Yes. Yeah. But I do think it's interesting just that idea that in charismatic churches, Americans in general, we can be a little more reserved, and it gives you an opportunity to be expressive, to dance, to sing, to be physical in some way. So that's really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things about being human that church offers us that the secular world doesn't have an answer for yet. But
Yes.
I think that's something that we may be able to make progress on in the future.
There you go.
So going straight from that to a Presbyterian church where like we had a rock band sort of, but like if people raised their hands, it was like they were like doing an act of faith and crucifying the flesh or something.
Yes. Yes. Dying of humiliation inside.
Totally. So that transition was definitely hard for me as a 14-year-old
Okay.
making that transition.
Yeah. And did you ever break out like some demonstrative aspect and get side-eyed?
How so?
I just mean if you were started to dance, right, you would probably get somebody looking at you askance, right?
Oh man. Yeah, that would have been so uncomfortable. I
Yeah.
guess that didn't cross my mind to do that.
Yes. Okay. You had good self-preservation instincts. Okay.
Absolutely. Especially as a ninth grader, I had to like preserve whatever social dignity I still had.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So around 14, then you're at the Presbyterian church, and what happens next?
Well, I can tell. So when I was 5 years old, a couple of really important things happened in my life.
Okay.
So in my family, like a lot of Christian families, we had like really toxic positivity and everything had to be like done
Yeah.
with joy. And you could never be like, I had a sad day or something like that. I mean, like you could, but at some point, at some age, then my parents would be like, oh, well, you must not be trusting God. Or like, if you're frustrated, you must be trying to control things too much and you need to release control to the Holy Spirit. Or,
Okay.
So it was not really a safe space to talk about emotions. And then I feel like going to a Southern Baptist school also wasn't the safest place to like talk about what you were thinking or feeling.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So when I was 5, I was really excited because during the church service, all my friends would like go back to the back and take communion together, which was grape juice in little plastic tumblers
Right.
and pita bread that I would help rip up before the service because we would all be like setting up the service beforehand.
Okay.
So when I was 5, my parents said I could get baptized if I wanted to. And if I was baptized, I would be allowed to go take communion, which was like a huge deal.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay. And so that was motivating to you at the time.
Oh, yeah. I was like, I want to take communion. And like, I'm hungry during church. So that would be great.
Yes. I love grape juice.
I love food.
Yeah. Okay.
So I remember my mom being like, well, she's only 5. Do you think she really understands like the gravity of what she's doing? And I can say in retrospect that no, I did not understand the gravity of what I was doing.
Right.
But also like YOLO. And when you're 5 and you want to take communion, then you go over to someone's pool and get baptized in it,
Yeah. Yeah. I've definitely talked on the podcast before about, I had my daughters baptized when they were 7, 8, 9, somewhere in that neighborhood. And I, to this day feel really deeply guilty about that, in that they could not possibly make that decision at the time.
I'm sure they wanted to.
Although they weren't quite as interested in communion. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
fair. Yeah, so that happened. And then also I remember I attended 2 different kindergarten orientations. And one was for the local public school, which had a really good like program and a lot of different opportunities. And one was for a Southern Baptist school that was about 30 minutes away.
Okay.
And my brothers went to the public school. So I thought I would go to the public school. And I had a couple friends that I thought I would be going with. But then my parents kind of decided that they couldn't send their beautiful small daughter on the school bus to the scary public school And so I would be like the first of the three kids to go to a Christian school.
Oh, wow. Okay. That was a momentous decision.
Yeah, definitely momentous for me. I think it kind of played into the narrative of like boys are tough and have to go make a living someday, but girls are fragile and like
Mm,
need to be protected from the scary world and just like I guess fear of outsiders as well.
right.
But while like I wouldn't say I got a bad education at the Christian school, I was bored all the time.
Right. Right.
And I was just like always like talking to other people or talking back to the teacher just because I was so bored. And like I think in retrospect, like that's when I really like learned to hate myself because I was always
Oh,
the
no.
bad kid who like wouldn't behave, but also like it makes me sad because it was so avoidable. Like we went to so much trouble to make that bad decision.
Right. Oh, wow.
Whereas I could have like for free gotten on the bus every day and gone to school. We were like driving an hour a day to go there and like paying money and all this stuff. And I just like it's hard for me to put myself in their shoes in that situation.
Oh, man. That breaks my heart. I feel like, bright kids, precocious kids suffer a lot, particularly in very restrictive Christian environments. And school's not great for everyone. Doesn't just because it was public doesn't mean it would have been great. But the bias against public schools is so strong within the Christian community. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I think at that time, so that was 1990. Like, I'm thinking what was going on at that time, like Gulf War and like very end of the Satanic Panic. So
Okay.
I don't know. That's just where people were at the time, especially in my community. But I always wonder. So now I'm a software developer, and I struggle a lot with problem solving, like creative thinking, like taking a big problem and then breaking it down into like 50 little pieces and then figuring out which little piece to do first. And I always wonder because the curriculums at the Christian schools are very like memorize it and spit it back out. And
Yeah.
the curriculum at the public school was super creative and had opportunities to do like destination imagination and stuff like that. I always wonder if like my job would be easier for me if I had gotten a better education on critical thinking.
Interesting. Yeah.
Luckily, you can learn a lot when you're an adult too. So,
Yes. Well, and that bright child has grown up to an intelligent woman. So clearly you are able to teach yourself, which I think is one of the most important skills in life in general. So obviously it breaks my heart. You say, you began to hate yourself. I take it you were getting negative feedback from teachers or the school?
yeah, I think just like I was always, I was just like a little bit of a handful for them.
Yeah.
Or I was always like challenging them, like, what about this? What about that? And it came across definitely in a very like negative way. And it kind of made me just think like, I knew it. Like I'm a bad person, which was
Oh,
my family's bias. Like they were always saying like how bad we all were. And I don't know, kind of a fixation on all of our negative qualities. So it's not surprising that I would come to that conclusion, but
interesting. I think one of the issues for a Christian context like that, where a young person is asking deep, significant questions, and the young person's just curious, right? You just want to know, right? You're not trying to undermine their faith, but the fact that they don't have solid answers for that, their only response can be frustration or anger or it is because it is. Just listen to me. Then you as a kid, you're doing you think, well, that it must be me instead of because you can't possibly recognize. No, the problem is that the faith system is fragile and can't handle scrutiny, even from a child.
for sure. Yeah, especially when the faith system surrounds everything that you know as reality. Like
Right.
it definitely can't be a problem with the faith system.
Yes. Wow.
And I'm guessing like there's a lot of other listeners who grew up like me, like all of our friends were Christians and like we listened to Focus on the Family and Adventures in Odyssey every night. And then my brothers were teenagers and they were listening to like Carmen and Striper and
Right.
all those early 90s and DC Talk a little bit later in the early 90s.
So yeah, your entire world ecosystem was full of Christians. So that is the beginning of a religious education, and what happens during that time.
So I ended up back in public school, and when we moved to a different part of Virginia that was more rural. That's when we ended up going to the Calvinist church.
Okay.
So that was pretty interesting in a few ways. One is the original charismatic church. Everyone there was kind of, I'm not sure how to say it. So my dad is like a white collar intellectual type of person, and everyone there was like mechanics and like more in the blue collar type of area, or like first generation college type of thing. And then when we moved and went to a new church, part of the reason I think my dad picked this church was everyone there was like doctors and lawyers, and he could like relate to them and talk about his job and stuff.
Okay.
So it was like, I don't know. I felt like as a 14-year-old, like I wasn't sure that I liked the choice of church, and I felt like the church was kind of chosen more as a social decision than like necessarily like a doctrinal one or whatever better reason I imagined that one would choose a church.
So you actually had kind of a spiritual perspective on this being a poor decision.
Well, there was a charismatic church in the area that I was interested in us attending, and then it was like, no, Dad chose this other church, and I kind of thought about why, and I was like, yeah, I guess the people in that church are more like Dad, so that kind of makes sense, you know.
And this is the transition to a more Calvinist perspective?
Yeah, so that was pretty challenging, just because like other people have said it in a lot of the groups I've been in, but there's like very, I don't know, Calvinism is very rigid and superior as a subculture of Christianity.
Yes.
And just talking to people who were like so sure about everything, and you're like, well, what about this? And I don't know, they were just like, well, that can't be true because of tulip or something, you know.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, yeah, it was rigid, I felt, but I also like enjoyed learning about it and was curious about it. So
Yeah. You may have heard me say, I think Calvinism is an area where software developer minded types people can sometimes gravitate towards, because it is an attempt at a systematic theology, and attempts to be intellectually rigorous, but as you say, it becomes rigid and quite self-satisfied in many ways.
yeah, I remember like um they would describe, more liberal churches and more liberal theologies, and just like throw up like straw men that I knew were straw men because I had been in other theologies, and I was like, well, that's not what they believe though.
Right. Right.
So there was a lot of straw manning. I feel like I don't know, I guess I appreciate it when churches can enjoy the strengths of their own theology without necessarily tearing down other Christians. So I'd say high school, there's not a lot that plays into my story except just continuing to be a Bible study leader and like be pretty involved. And people always said like, oh, some of you guys are going to fall away in college, or, go do your own thing. And I was like, but that's not going to be me, because I'm a serious person. And
Right.
it's going to be one of these other jokers out there that are watching R-rated movies and saying cuss words.
Yes.
So when I was 18, I went to college, and I went to a Lutheran college called St. Olaf College. They had a really good choir program, and I was interested in studying that.
Okay.
So what I didn't realize was that I was going from Virginia to Minnesota, and it is a lot darker in Minnesota in the winter and than it is in Virginia. And I didn't know that I actually have seasonal depression.
Oh, wow.
Because I'd never been through a really dark winter before.
Yes, I hear Minnesota is like the ice box of the United States or something. So.
I don't know, Minnesota, Wisconsin, something in there has got to be tied.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I went there. I met some people from InterVarsity my very first day at school and got involved with InterVarsity, was super excited. I got to go to their huge nationwide conference called Urbana my freshman year,
Okay.
which is like right after Christmas. So you go like during Christmas break. And it was really good. I really made good friends there. I'm still friends with some of the people that I made friends with in my first few days of school. And
Wow. Yeah.
yeah, so got really involved with that. And I guess a couple things happened. So one thing was we were trying to do evangelism on our campus, and it didn't really work because it was a Lutheran school. So there weren't a lot of people that were unchurched.
Right.
So it wasn't like at the school in my hometown, like Campus Crusade goes out with like a bunch of watermelons or something in the first week, and there's like hundreds of people that want to come, and it's like this giant like hyped up thing, and they have
Yeah.
like laser lights and smoke and stuff at their
Yes.
at their gatherings and stuff. And like my school just wouldn't work that way. Like people weren't into that. People were more serious. And while we knew a lot of the Bible, like we could quote a lot of the Bible, the people around us knew a lot more about the Bible. And I think that's what we didn't realize. Like they
Interesting.
knew the
Yeah.
context it came from, and like they knew there were two Genesis creation stories, and we didn't. And they knew that like a bunch of stories were just allegory, and we thought that we interpreted them as literal. And they knew about all the like the Q manuscript and all these like where the gospels come from. We could quote a lot more of the gospels, but we didn't know the context, and I think that was pretty key.
Well, I think it's just fascinating that you were in a slightly more conservatively, theologically conservative organization trying to evangelize on a Christian campus. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. I mean, like to us, they were still non-Christians because they were like swearing and having sex before marriage and like
Yeah.
drinking alcohol, which you weren't allowed to do on our campus, but also like we were under 21, so it was illegal.
Right.
So those were all signs to us that they didn't really understand the gospel.
I see.
So I remember like I started a couple of Bible studies, and in one of them I was using InterVarsity has like a curriculum called Groups Investigating God. So I was using their curriculum, and it was going through the book of Jonah. And I remember we were talking, and I said something about what happened. And I remember a couple of my freshmen were like, but that story is not really real, right? It's like these different reasons, and people can't fit into fish and stuff.
Yeah.
And like the wheels kind of started turning in my mind because like I wasn't sure if I thought it was real or not. So there was this moment where like in the Bible study, I'm the leader, and I'm like, well, but like God can do anything. So, it could be real. And then I was like, no, I know it's allegory, but like it could be real, but
Yeah.
this is waffling.
So you were on the fragile side of that conversation.
For sure. Yeah, and it's like definitely uncomfortable when you think that you have a situation under control and you know what you're talking about, and then you're just like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I have no idea. Yeah.
Especially when you're like bringing the lost to God, and then the lost are like teaching you things, and you're like really confused.
Yes.
So that was like one example of something that happened. The challenges of trying to bring people who are more educated than you into the fold.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I still like, I don't know, things were like pretty compartmentalized. So I was like, well, yeah, there might be like two creation stories that kind of contradict each other, and like some, or maybe the creation isn't even like a real story. Maybe it's like an allegory or like just a myth that's like teaches a lesson, or maybe like all those things. And I was like, but I still think God is real, and like I still believe what I believe. So it wasn't necessarily like swaying me.
You are telling my story.
Yeah, I mean, like I was compartmentalized enough.
Yes. Yeah. I think you make just little adjustments. You don't see it all at one time, but it's like a little bit here, a little bit there. Okay, Jonah is allegorical, and okay, the two Genesis stories are metaphorical and have different theological points of view. But but you're still just making it okay. Like I can still believe in this.
Yeah, I remember one of my ancient history professors was like, And while they were in Babylon, the priests actually changed their own history. Like, can you even imagine people doing that? And what's in the Bible is some of the stuff that was changed. And I was just like, what? Like, there was just always a little something else coming to like challenge me.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that it would have been from like rabid atheists who had an agenda, because I was taught that like biblical scholars were just people with agendas who were trying to rationalize their sinful lifestyle or something.
Yes.
But it was just like historian scholars and like biblical scholars who were also Christians, but just a different type of Christian. So I wasn't sure if that was what to make of that, you know. Anyway, all that's going on, but the big like event that happened that changed me forever was happened during my sophomore year. I started feeling like funny in a way I couldn't describe.
Okay.
And I started feeling like I was really far away from everybody else, and like I would have conversations with people and feel I didn't have a feeling of connection like I did before.
Okay.
And it kind of felt like there was like an itch in my head that I couldn't reach, like some weird static that was making it impossible for me to focus on anything or
Mm-hmm.
connect to anything. And I didn't even realize that it could be like a depression, because A, I wasn't sad, I just felt odd.
Okay.
And B, I had never met anyone who said they were having a depression, or like definitely not anyone my age, but like not anyone of any age.
Right.
Because depression was like you need to pray more, or like you took drugs or something, you know? And I was just like this vanilla, like doesn't drink 19-year-old who leads Bible studies. So like I couldn't imagine that I could be having a depression until one of my friends said, like, I think you're having a depression.
Interesting.
And I was just like blown over by that. Like I just couldn't even imagine that that could be true. And I was like, what's wrong with me? Like, and so I started talking to different people, and some Christians I knew, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I take medication for depression." Like several of my mentors were like, "Oh yeah, I do that," but like
Yeah.
it had never come up before because it wasn't something you talked about in Christianity.
Oh, wow. Interesting. So even the people that you were looking up to were okay with that, but they hadn't told you because it was just kind of not socially acceptable.
Yeah, in the church I grew up in, the super charismatic church, I remember there were a lot of people that we would pray for healing for, and I remember one of the adults had, I think she had depression, and we would pray for, you know, God to cast out the spirit of depression and all these things. And it seemed like, well, if she's still depressed, it's her fault at this point, you know?
Oh, man.
And I remember we prayed for someone with epilepsy, and they were like, well, she must be in rebellion because she hasn't gotten better, even though we prayed for her.
That's an easy out, isn't it? Yeah.
It is an easy out, and it's really sad in retrospect.
Yeah.
So, not knowing that I had depression, I like couldn't even talk about it. Like I didn't even know how to bring up to my friends that I was like feeling weird, and I started wanting to die. And it wasn't like I was sad, it was just like everything's far away and I can't feel anything, and it doesn't feel good to be alive anymore.
Wow.
So it got like really scary there for a while. And that was, I would say that was the darkest winter of my whole life, just like not knowing what was going on, and like thinking about dying a lot, like every single day. And I was supposed to be like college, like best time of your life. You're not, I wasn't working, I was just getting to study, and everything was supposed to be perfect, and it wasn't. It was so hard.
I think that what is destructive about the Christian bias against therapy or recognizing one's depression or mental health issues is that, it's pretty normal. You've gone off to college. Maybe you're gaining new friends, but you've left family behind. You've got probably a huge workload. And in your case, you're experiencing, a darker winter than you were used to. There's a bunch of reasons why a person would be depressed. Homesickness alone would do it. But the Christianity had taught you not to reach out, not to ask for help. So, man, that's devastating.
It was bad. Like I, you know how, men have a really bad problem with suicide as a demographic.
I've
And in
heard
a
I've
lot of
heard that.
cases, yeah, and in a lot of cases, they don't talk to anyone. So they seem really happy. And then you find out that they're dead and you're like, whoa, what happened?
Right.
And I really got a new understanding of that because I tried to bring it up hundreds of times to friends, like what was going on with me. And I just could not even think of the words to say or like couldn't even think how to ask for help. So, like, I imagine
Mm.
that lots of men try to bring it up to someone and or probably almost everybody try to bring it up and just can't get the words when it's something that's been so shamed and so swept under the rug for
Right.
your entire life.
And how did you resolve that? Were you able to find some help?
So it kind of like broke my compartmentalization. So like my whole life I had been like I'd always wondered, what about people that never hear about Jesus, or like what about people that are suffering seemingly for no reason, like children that are born with cancer or like natural disasters that happen to people. And I always just am, I guess, like when you grow up in a really prosperous um, country and
Mhm.
like the government always helps people like rebuild after natural disasters, and you also live in an area that doesn't have many, and like babies that are born with cancer sometimes get better because we have the drugs, and like so you learn to just be like, oh, that's like other people and that's their problems and I shouldn't worry about their problems. But when you're in a dire situation where you want to die and you're thinking about dying all the time and you're screaming to God like, please help me figure out how to like get help or contact someone, or like just make it clear that you're there, because you say in so many psalms and so many parts of the Bible that you're there with us, like please, like
Yeah.
anything would satisfy me, and there's just nothing, or you just get worse and worse nightmares.
Yeah.
You start to be like, wait, like when these people in Yemen are dying of the famine, like they must feel the same, like God's not saving them. And then you're like, what's the difference between there being a God and there not being a God, or there
Oof.
being a good God and there being a bad God? Well, it seems the same.
Yeah.
Seems like a God that had malice toward us would be doing the same things right now as a God that has love toward us.
It's a dangerous question to ask. Yes.
And there's some like, I don't know, there were some like songs and books during that time that really resonated with me. Like Jars of Clay has a song on their 11th hour album called, I think it's called Silence. But it's just like the whole song is just like, where are you? And like
Yeah.
screaming into the void and like using every method to like bang down the door, and like nothing happens.
I think it's particularly vicious in that you're calling out to God in desperation. Please do something, do anything. You're receiving deafening silence. And again, that natural instinct is to point back at yourself. It must be something that I'm doing. I need to pray more, or I need to read the Bible more, or I need to do more evangelism, instead of recognizing, as you said earlier, this looks like non-existence at this point.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know if God isn't there or if God is bad, but they seem to functionally look the same.
Right.
So I didn't know what to do with that. So I carried that with me and it became like the question that I needed an answer for. And while like the depression got better in the summer and I started getting treatment, and it took me a while, but I found some treatment that was helpful.
Okay.
Um, well, first of all, I'll say that like I wasn't honest with the doctors and therapists that I saw because I was afraid that they would tell my parents, and it was so humiliating.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they were like, "Are you thinking about dying, or like do you have suicidal thoughts?" And I would say no because I was so afraid that they would like make me go to the hospital or do something else where my parents would find out.
Right.
So that was like one challenge of like raising your kids in such a stigmatized environment. I got better for a while, and after I graduated from college, I started going to L'Abri to try to get answers. So L'Abri means the shelter in French, and it was started, I think, in the 60s by Francis Schaeffer. And it's a community that you can go stay in for a while, and they have like a giant library. And so it's like a structured day. Like in the mornings, you switch between mornings and afternoons, but in the mornings you might be on the work crew, so helping maintain like the house that they have for you to stay in.
Okay.
And then in the afternoons you might be on study, so you'd have like 3 hours to like sit in their library and study. And
Okay.
then you work together with the people that live there to like make the meals for everybody and wash the dishes for everybody. And you can kind of go for as long as you want. So I went 3 or 4 times, but I just went for a long time, a couple of times. So I stayed
Okay.
for 3 weeks after I graduated college, and then stayed for 6 weeks, like a year and a half later.
Was that comforting? Was that a solace for you?
It was very comforting,
Yeah.
and it definitely did feel like a shelter because I didn't have to worry about anything outside stuff. I didn't take a car, so I was just like there doing my thing. And you have a tutor, so one of the people that's on staff, usually they're like in middle age or older. They help you find books to read on what you're interested in. They have a bunch of tapes you can listen to of like sermons and lectures. Yeah, so I felt like protected by that as well, like having someone to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
And I don't know, when I got back, I think my conclusion was like I had a really good time, but I didn't get answers to the questions that I had. Like there were books you could read, and I read a book that was like, what do you trust God for? And it was basically like people trust God for all kinds of things, like getting a parking spot or all these frivolous concerns,
Yes.
consumerism. But God never says you can trust him for those things.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But it seems like you actually can't trust God for anything because he doesn't help you with anything.
Right.
Yeah. And then I remember like one night so they have Bible study on Wednesday nights for people that are Christians and want to go to that. So I went to that one Wednesday night, and they were doing a psalm, and it was like, the Lord watches over you, the sun will not smite you by day nor the moon by night, and uh, those sorts of assurances.
Right.
And I just couldn't take it. Like I was just like, but what about when you're just like drowning and there's like no help coming? And I remember like the Bible study leader just lost it on me and was like, this psalm was the only thing that got me through my mother's death.
Oh no. Oh no.
And he was like, you have no imagination.
Wow.
And I was like, and then he apologized later. And I was like, I think this just tells me that they're not ready to answer these questions either. Like the answers they have satisfy them and they don't satisfy me. And I don't know what to do with that.
The episode with Sarah, we talked about some of the songs that we sing, and psalms are very similar in that they make grandiose statements about God always being there, never failing, and 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 that you suddenly realize, wait a minute, never. I mean, that I can't say never. Like I've I've reached out for this and this, and and God hasn't come through.
Yeah. And it's not just like, a Christian will say, oh, well, God says no to things sometimes. It's not just that. It's like there's so much evil and pain in the world that doesn't need to be.
Right.
And like there's the problem of theodicy, right? Like God's all powerful and all loving, yet allows all these things to happen that are unnecessary. And like no one's like, I thought when I was depressed, like, oh, maybe someday I'll be happy this happened to me, and I'll be like, oh, I grew so much. And then I just got this pit in my stomach, and I was like, no one should ever have to go through this. There is
Mm,
no lesson that is worth this amount of agony.
absolutely. Yeah, I think the Christians will tend to try to make suffering useful somehow, and sometimes it's just pointless.
Yeah.
Actually, that can be relieving to be able to admit is not useful in any way. It has no purpose. It isn't it isn't making me a better person. It is just suffering.
This is just suck. That's all it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, like, the problem of theodicy, but then there's the problems of like teleological evil,
Hmm.
where like it seems like things were made in a bad way. So, like, the problem of predation, like, some animals are made, if you are a creationist, some animals are made with pointy teeth and they can't digest like grass. So they need
Right.
to rip other animals apart alive in order to survive.
Right.
Some animals, like, here's an example, like the North American short-tailed shrew, it secretes venom from a gland in its lower jaw to paralyze prey. But the point of the paralysis is to keep the prey alive longer so that it can feed over an extended period of time. So, like, if it does that to a mouse, it's just doing it so the mouse will stay alive and suffer longer, but also it can eat the mouse for longer.
Yeah, the description of nature from the biblical perspective versus an evolutionary perspective could not be more different. Like, I think Christians want to say, "Oh, look, all the beautiful birds, and they're different colors, and they fit right in their environment. Isn't that amazing?" And not
Yeah,
recognizing, the evolution explains that with more detail and explains predation and some of the things that, from kind of a human perspective, we might find violent and destructive and unnecessary in some cases.
absolutely. Around the time I was in college, a lot of the emergent church stuff was coming out.
Okay.
So reading like Brian McLaren and Shane Claiborne. And I think it was Shane Claiborne who said, like, it's hard when you realize that the God you worship is the same God who like committed genocide by causing a flood.
Right.
And like I had never even thought of it that way. So that like totally blew my mind at the time. But it continued to stay with me as I saw like like God boasts about a lot of violence in the Old Testament. And it's not just like, oh yeah, I had to do this, but I love them. I didn't really mean to do it. It's like, nope, I'm gonna slash open your womb and like you know, kill the babies and all this stuff. I'm gonna dash them against the rocks. Or like when he mauls children with bears in that story of Elijah.
Yes.
Like I feel like, and maybe this is because of like Calvinism, but I mean, in Calvinism, they're like, oh, that was, the same God, and God just worked in different ways and all this stuff. But Calvinism makes you see how much God could do and doesn't.
Yeah, I have to say real quick that started in more Pentecostal, but I had a beloved theology teacher who was a Reformed theologian and liked aspects of the Reformed theology. I liked the idea of a sovereign God, but it only makes sense if you don't think of the implications, if you don't look at, well, what does this mean beyond being comforting to me? The idea of, double predestination, or just as you say, the lack of action on God's part, though he is sovereign, those implications start to just fan out and become very difficult to maintain.
Yeah, it's pretty, I don't know, it's challenging and it's hard how certain people seem to feel about it and how smug they seem to feel about it, given the implications for other people.
Yeah.
So after college, I ended up in an Episcopal church. I was more going the liturgical route because there was so much cognitive dissonance on some of the, like, going constantly through truth claims that didn't seem quite true.
Mm.
So going to the Episcopal church was great. That was my favorite church that I've ever gone to. I'm still friends with a lot of the people from that church, but just with like the cognitive dissonance of like, I mean, like even at that church, people being like, God helped me find fabric, or like, God helped me find Easter candy. And I was like, God can't be bothered to like help children survive. I seriously doubt if God is getting you a parking place at the game, you know?
Yes. Yes.
But it became like repugnant to me to worship a God who A, boasted so much about doing so much violence, and B, didn't seem to be present. I mean, I would say it was like both a mental and emotional decision. Like it was a whole being decision. Like, I just can't deal with this.
Yeah.
It seems unlikely to be true. And it also is just, if all of this is true, then like I'm worshiping a madman. Like I'm worshiping someone worse than Hitler, and I'm not going to do that.
Mm.
So I ended up just being like, I just need a break from all of this. And around that time, I moved to New York for a job. And that was like a convenient time to just like make a break with going to church because I just couldn't take it. Like I would go to the service and just start panicking from like all the cognitive dissonance.
Right.
And then like 4 or 5 years later, I was like, man, I thought I was taking a break from this and I'd be ready to go back at some point, but I am just not. And someone messaged me and was like, have you seen this group on Facebook? It's called, something about ex-Christians.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, ex-Christians? Like, whoa, that's really like a big thing. I don't think I want to call myself an ex-Christian. I'm just going through something unique that I don't understand.
Exactly. No one else has ever gone through this.
And it seemed that way. And at that time, there were like maybe 2 or 3 deconversion podcasts. Now there's so many out there. But at that time, there weren't a lot. And so I ended up starting listening to some podcasts, and I stumbled on the Everyone's Agnostic podcast, which had a lot of people who had similar backgrounds to me. And I was like, whoa, there can be like good people just like me who are going through this exact same thing. Like it was mind blowing after so many years of going it alone. And everyone I talked to was like, no, you just have to believe, or.
Right.
So that was like amazing. And at some point after that, I was like, yeah, I think I am an ex-Christian. Maybe that is what describes me. And so I ended up kind of growing a comfort level with actually leaving on a permanent basis.
I do think that's interesting in that when you're going through a deconstruction, deconversion, whatever terms we might use today, but when you're in the middle of it, you don't know those terms. You're not Googling those terms. And how you even discover a podcast or a blog or a YouTube channel that could help is challenging because you don't want, you're not going to search for atheist things. That's way too scary. That's way out. And just, like not having the terminology even to ask the question, how do other people go through the kinds of questions that I'm going through?
Absolutely. Yeah, and even people that have left, you kind of come up with a rationalization in your mind about why they left. Like you're like, oh, he just wanted to sleep with his girlfriend, so he wasn't, that's not like my case. My case is like noble and like I want to leave because of like these ethical reasons. And so like I'm not like those people.
Right.
And you still like keep that paradigm of like Christians good, people not the right kind of Christian bad, or not Christian at all. And like I still had that fear, the same fear that made my parents not want to send me to public school with the other 5-year-olds. I still had that fear of other people and thinking that, they would have bad motivations or always trying to be taking advantage of me. So I think getting rid of that and coming to a more, I don't know, a more nuanced place, I would say.
Yeah.
Has been a change for sure.
And so, Ginna, do you have like a friend group or any kind of secular community that you're connected to these days?
It's still kind of in process. So when I was in New York, I started a group called Recovering Ex-Christians.
Okay.
And we ended up getting together with some people who were recovering Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and some people who were recovering Muslims. And it was so interesting because, again, didn't think I had anything in common with those people, but the fundamentalist teachings of Judaism and Islam and Christianity are so similar.
Right.
All these like outsiders bad, insiders good, like sex in movies is bad, sex before marriage is bad, like don't socialize with people outside our group. And then like same things for women, like protect women. Women need to be coddled and kept inside and kept under control. And like They need to dress more modestly, and all these things, are just like the same in all these fundamentalist mentalities.
The particulars might be different, but the kind of the underlying structure is pretty similar.
It was amazing. Like I just thought like, oh, Islam, that's totally different from me, but it was extremely similar. Talking to people, so that was eye-opening as well. But I moved to Colorado a few years ago, and now I'm kind of rebuilding my network here.
You've mentioned Everyone's Agnostic. We don't need to mention this one, but like what are some of the other podcasts or resources that you recommend for people who might be in the middle of those questions?
That's a great question. Well, I think most recently I've been getting really interested in what do we do now, like now that we're secular, because I think
Yeah.
that people have the same needs, but a lot of our needs are now not filled by anything. So, like, people want to sing together.
Yeah.
People want to do potlucks. People want to have like a short list of people they can trust, and I don't have kids. And so I also don't have like a parents group that's a network.
Okay.
I just have coworkers, and I need a group that's outside of coworkers.
Yeah.
So I've been listening a lot to the Humanize Me podcast that Bart Campolo is doing.
Love Bart Campolo. Yeah, that's great.
And that's been pretty interesting because I'd say when I started being in, well, when I started, I guess, being an atheist or not being a Christian, I was like, all right, now I know these new truths. I need everyone else to know them too, and I will tell them to them, and they will like have these
Yes.
mind blowing. I was like, they want to know the truth, right? Like, I'm sure when I was
Yeah.
a Christian, I wanted to know the truth. And then, like, I don't know, I thought back and I was like, actually, I'm not sure if I really did want to know the truth. I think I just wanted to, like, be part of what I was part of and, like, keep doing that. So maybe not. But, like, I think, like, Bart Campolo is, like, really different in that he's, like, I don't know, this sounds really relativistic, but he's like, whatever is helping you is good.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far, but I think that it's cruel to take something away from somebody without offering them something that could replace it. So it's hard for me to be like, you should not be a Christian anymore. And I also can't offer you like any community support or any place to sing with your neighbors or like any, you know. So I feel like until we have more secular community built up, that I don't know, like I'm happy that I went through the deconversion and like it was so hard and I didn't want it or wish for it. Um, but I have grown a lot and like obviously like some part of me wants other people to experience that same pain so that they too can grow and like misery loves company.
Yeah.
But yeah, have the growth. But then I also am like, but I can't offer you a community and I don't know that I would wish being communityless on you.
Man, I love everything you've said there. That's half of the reason why I started the podcast is that very thing. I have a blog post that talks about the magic feather of faith or the placebo effect of faith, and that I recognize in my past that I needed that various times in my life. It helped me get over
Mm,
some obstacles. And so now I do think, we've discovered some truth. I've learned some things, and yet I have no desire of yanking that magic feather out of people's hands, right? Like it's doing something for people. And as long as they're not in a destructive Christian environment, it's something I don't want to sweep out from underneath them. But the most important thing you've said is just how we need to provide something similar. We need to provide, Anthony Pinn called it a soft place to land, that there's some kind of community for people to move to. Because right now, I think particularly kind of in the atheist community, it's like, good luck, you're on your own. and there are a few people, some personality types where that's going to work, but most people, that's not enough. They need to have a group of people that are going to carry them through that process, and I think we desperately need to make that happen.
for sure.
I was just going to say I'd make a plug really quick for things like Sunday Assembly. There are some ethical societies, things you can find on meetup.com to find this kind of thing. Obviously, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. Hopefully, when that is over, we will have more options for that to take place.
Absolutely. And the organization Recovering from Religion is working on getting some local meetups together for folks. I think that's still in process,
Fantastic. Yeah.
but hopefully more stuff is going to open up. I know a lot of people have stopped going to church during the pandemic and been doing some deconstruction, so there's more and more need for that.
All right. And then for the people out there who are in a dark place, and whether it's related to faith deconstruction or not, but they are questioning why they should live, what's the advice you give them? And then what are some resources that they can reach out to?
That's a great question. I would say if you've gone to the doctor and just had trouble finding, the right treatment, I would encourage you to continue doing that. I probably had to try like 7 or 8 different treatments before I found something that was helpful to me.
Okay.
Because some types are more rare than others, and they're doing more and more research to try to come up with better treatments. So I would say, you're not alone. There's a lot of people that have to try a lot of treatments before they can find something good. And, it's just not easy. One of the books I read, it was Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. He's a Quaker, and I read it while I was still a Christian, while I was going through the Depression. And there's more to that story, but I'll just share this. He went through some really bad depressions, and one of the only things that was helpful to him was every day his friend would come over and rub his feet. And sometimes his friend would be like, I can feel that you're not feeling good today. And sometimes his friend would be like, I feel like the depression has lifted a little bit, just from like how tense or not tense his feet were, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, he went through, I think it was like 10, 15 years of just really dark depression. And one time at a conference, a woman came up to him that was experiencing depression and said, why is it that some people just get better right away? Like they're like, oh, I just took Zoloft and now I'm better. And other people, they suffer for years and years and years. And like, why doesn't God help them? And Parker Palmer just said, I don't know. Like, I wish I knew, but I don't know.
That's honest.
I was really honest.
Ginna, thank you for your honesty here. I think definitely there are going to be people out there who relate to your story, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to tell your story.
Thanks so much for your time today. It was really nice to meet you.
Final thoughts on the episode. I say all the time how amazing it is when you are hearing someone else tell their story and you have so many points of recognition. That is definitely the case for me listening to Ginna, having a conversation with her and then re-listening to the conversation for this edit. As I said at the intro, Ginna has a way of reducing some of these absurd things about Christianity into a single sentence that reveals the truth in a powerful way. I'll quote just a handful of the things that she said. In my family, like many Christian families, we had a really toxic positivity. Everything had to be done with joy. You could never have a sad day. That really struck home to me, that the admission of everything isn't perfect, which is, by the way, a human experience, is just not allowed in many, many contexts. I particularly felt for her when she talked about going to L'Abri, the shelter area, where she really went there specifically looking for answers. And a couple of things jumped out from that. She said, I realize they are not ready to answer these questions either. The answers they have satisfy them, but they don't satisfy me, and I don't know what to do with that. I think that really captures it. The believers in our lives, the apologists, have answers. It's not that they don't have answers. It's that they are not satisfying to us, and they satisfy them. And the struggle is to come to the point where you recognize it's okay that it doesn't satisfy me. The answers they have don't satisfy me, and I can move on, which of course Ginna does. And then one more quote, Ginna says, God can't be bothered to help children survive. I seriously doubt if God is getting you a parking place for the game. Again, she captures something in just that single sentence. Both the trivialities of what many people's reports of God's goodness really are, and the desire for God to have actually acted, but the frustration and the pain and the hurt of the silence of God. The theme that came through all of Ginna's story was the hiddenness of God. Her willingness to believe, her 100% being in, but having to admit slowly but surely that God isn't there, and that the amount of prayer that he answered was just as much if God did not exist, or even worse, if God were evil. She talked about, but it seems like you can't actually trust God for anything because he doesn't help with anything. I definitely also want to highlight how important what Ginna had to say about depression was, both the need to talk about it within Christian circles, but also she had something deeply insightful to say about seeking medical attention, in that it took her multiple attempts, multiple different therapies, multiple different medications potentially, before she found the right combination of things that helped her. Keep in mind that you have to own your own healthcare. I do not mean this in the I'm going to go do my own research about this vaccine kind of way. I mean more in that you have to be your own advocate and keep pushing with your doctors that this therapy is not working. Let's try another one. And pushing that forward. So I am very, very thankful to Ginna for being on the podcast. I thank her for being so honest, for being so articulate, and more than that, for the vulnerability to share with us about depression and to be honest about that. And I just related to a lot of her story. So thank you, Ginna, for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is definitely about community. I am so excited that Arlene has stepped up to the plate to take on the community building. Arlene is going to be the community manager there, so I've encouraged her to pick her own team of moderators and build a team around her. Ginna really captured what we are trying to accomplish with the new Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, and that is trying to answer the question, what next? What do we do now after deconversion, deconstruction? And the goal is to create a supportive community that is a soft place to land for people who are in the middle of or after deconversion and deconstruction. A place where people can know they are not alone. They can hear from each other that what they're going through is normal. Ultimately, what I'm hoping for this group is a place to practice secular grace with one another. The group is Deconversion Anonymous. You can find it at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. And of course, there will be links in the show notes. I also want to thank Logan Thomas for doing the new artwork, which again will be coming out over the next week or so. I want to thank Mike T for editing. I want to thank Jimmy and Colin for helping me with some ideas about book reviews and movie reviews and things of that nature. So we've got lots of things happening that is community-based. So think about how you can participate as well and let me know. gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Until next week, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.